The fourth largest producer of oil and gas in the world, Canada exports 97% of its resource to the U.S. Canada is dependent on U.S. consumers, but the U.S. needs Canadian oil too.
If America is truly as strong as it claims, then why can a single shift in Canadian oil supply rattle the entire U.S. Midwest? That question isn't just uncomfortable, it cuts straight into the heart of a silent economic truth Washington has tried to avoid confronting for years. Because beneath the patriotic speeches, the tariff walls, the promises of independence, lies a structural weakness so deeply embedded into America's industrial core that even a minor tremor from Alberta can feel like an earthquake in Chicago, Detroit, or Milwaukee. The revelation is brutal in its simplicity. The United States built an energy machine that only functions smoothly as long as Canada keeps turning the valve. The moment that flow wavers, even slightly, refineries across the Midwest begin to strain, transportation networks tighten, and gasoline markets start to twitch like a nervous system sensing pain. This is not speculation. This is architecture. A design flaw created decades ago, locked into steel, concrete, and pipelines stretching thousands of miles. The very backbone of American industry is calibrated to one specific input, the heavy, sulfur-rich crude from the oil sands of Alberta. And here's the twist. For years, Canada was treated as a predictable supplier, a background character in America's energy story. Quiet, consistent, always available. But the world has changed. Canada has changed. With new export corridors opening westward and global buyers lining up with open checkbooks, a country once trapped behind geography has suddenly discovered that it has options and leverage. That leverage doesn't need threats, speeches, or bold declarations. It simply exists. Silent, structural, unavoidable. So when Washington raises new tariff walls, the loudest noise isn't the hammering of political rhetoric. It's the quiet realization echoing through boardrooms and policy circles. The United States may no longer be the one holding the dominant position in this relationship. A single adjustment, a rerouted shipment, a redirected tanker, a recalibrated contract, is enough to send shockwaves across the American heartland. If America is as powerful as it insists, then why does one move from Canada feel like a pull on its emergency brake? That is the answer we're about to uncover, layer by layer, because this isn't just an energy story. It's a map of hidden dependencies, buried leverage, and a continental power dynamic shifting in real time. Washington did not build its tariff wall quietly. It was announced with the thunder of certainty, the kind of political bravado that promises to protect American workers and restore economic fairness. A 25% barrier, tall, solid, uncompromising, suddenly rose around nearly every major Canadian export. Cars were pushed back. Metals were walled out. Food was caught in the crossfire. From the outside, it looked like a fortress designed to shield America from an increasingly competitive neighbor to the north. But as the dust settled and analysts began to read the fine print, something strange emerged. For all the noise about tough trade action, there was one item conspicuously spared the full force of the wall. One crucial resource placed behind only a 10% tariff. One door that Washington, for all its rage, could not bring itself to lock oil from Alberta. That exception became the first crack in the narrative. Why would a government so determined to display strength make its most vulnerable point so visible? Why build a wall so high, only to leave a side gate unlocked? The answer lies not in politics, but in engineering, in the steel bones of America's energy system, a structure that reveals a truth more powerful than rhetoric. The United States is far more dependent on Canadian oil than it has ever publicly admitted. And not just any oil. A very specific kind, produced in a very specific place, under conditions that no other supplier can immediately replicate. The Midwest refineries that fuel the American heartland are not flexible machines. They are creatures of habit, built in an era when designers assumed the future would look like the past. Their units, pipes, and catalytic crackers were calibrated for heavy, sulfur-rich crude, the dense, stubborn oil that flows from the sands of northern Alberta. Over the decades, these refineries became hardwired, locked into a chemical diet they can't easily change without tearing their own guts out. Retrofitting them for lighter oil from Texas or Saudi Arabia would cost billions, require years of downtime, and create chaos across supply chains that depend on uninterrupted output. The system doesn't just prefer Canadian oil. It is engineered around it. That dependence is measurable. Over 62% of all oil imported into the United States now comes from Canada. In the Midwest, the ratio grows even more extreme. Nearly 3/4 of refinery input is Canadian crude. Every pump across the region, every airport, every truck fleet, every factory conveyor belt, traces its lifeline back to the same northern source. What looks like a diversified energy landscape from afar becomes a single-channel dependency when viewed from inside the distribution network. The pipelines, the junctions, the blending facilities, the storage hubs, they all point to one direction on the map. And so the tariff wall, for all its bravado, was built around this reality. Washington could tax cars. It could tax steel. It could tax vegetables, batteries, lumber, and dairy. But it could not fully tax the one thing that keeps its industrial engine alive. The 10% exception for Alberta crude wasn't a sign of strategy, but a sign of constraint. It revealed where the U.S. had to kneel to the architecture of its own infrastructure. This was the first unspoken admission. The tariff wall was not a weapon. It was a map of the places America could afford to hit, and the one place it could not. But the story grows even more lopsided when we pull back the camera and look at Canada's position. For decades, Alberta was framed as the dependent partner in this relationship, a raw material supplier chained to a single buyer. 97% of its oil exports went south. Politicians in Washington liked to frame this as leverage, as though Canada needed access to U.S. markets more than the U.S. needed the oil itself. That illusion collapsed the moment engineers began speaking candidly about what would happen if the northern flow slowed even modestly. Production cuts, price spikes, downtime, bottlenecks, the Midwest grinding to a crawl. And so the unlocked door in America's tariff fortress was not charity. It was self-preservation. Yet even this dynamic, powerful buyer, dependent seller, was already beginning to warp by the time the tariff wall went up. Canada had been shifting quietly, almost invisibly, away from the idea that its only path to prosperity lay south. The Trans-Mountain expansion was nearing completion. Asian markets had begun expressing interest in bypassing American middlemen. Alberta had started speaking like a region with options instead of obligations. Whether Washington realized it or not, the ground beneath its strategy was already moving. This is what makes the 10% tariff so revealing. It is not just a technical detail. It is a confession. It exposes the fragility of an energy system that looks powerful on the surface but trembles beneath. It shows where America's loudest policies collide with its least negotiable needs. And it hints at a future in which that unlocked door may become the very feature that shifts the balance of continental power. Because if you build a wall but leave one door open, the real question is not why you left it unlocked. It's what happens when the person on the other side decides they no longer want to walk through it. As long as Canada kept sending its crude south, America could maintain the illusion of control. But the moment Canada gained an escape route, a way to send the same heavy crude across the Pacific, into tanks waiting in Shanghai, Busan, or Yokohama, the relationship changed forever. The buyer was no longer the anchor, the seller no longer the captive. And a tariff wall designed to intimidate suddenly looked like a monument to a past that no longer existed. The truth emerging in this chapter of the story is simple, but devastating. The United States built the structure, but Canada holds the key. And a key is most powerful not when it opens a door, but when it decides which doors stay closed. For most of modern history, the geography of North America dictated the destiny of Canadian oil. The mountains to the west were too steep, the coastline too narrow, the politics too tangled. Everything flowed south by necessity, not by choice. Pipelines carved their way into the American Midwest like arteries into a single, oversized heart. Washington didn't just receive Canadian oil, it assumed it would always receive Canadian oil. That assumption became the backbone of America's energy confidence, the quiet belief that no matter how loud the policy fights became, the supply from Alberta would remain steady because it had nowhere else to go. And then, almost without ceremony, that world ended. The completion of the Trans-Mountain expansion, TMX, was not just the opening of a pipeline. It was the unsealing of a nation. On the day crude first surged through its expanded channels, Canada's energy map changed in a way no tariff, no speech, and no political maneuver could reverse. A corridor nearly tripled in capacity roared to life, lifting flows from roughly 300,000 barrels per day to nearly 890,000, a jump so large it reshaped not only Alberta's prospects, but the entire continental balance. What makes this transformation extraordinary is not the engineering feat itself, but what it symbolizes. For the first time since Canada became an energy producer, its most valuable resource no longer had to pass through American territory to reach the world. Tankers waiting quietly off the Pacific coast began filling with Alberta crude that once had only a single destination. That isolation, that dependence, that inevitability, gone in an instant. A nation that once had a single buyer suddenly had an ocean. With the corridor opened, a remarkable shift unfolded. Shipments that once trickled outward at 80,000 barrels per day surged toward nearly 400,000. Behind those numbers lies a political story told not through treaties or declarations, but through invoices and shipping manifests. Each barrel that left the Pacific ports carried a quiet message. Canada was no longer trapped. And the world, especially those searching for stable long-term suppliers, had been waiting for this moment. Among the new buyers, one stood out for its scale and silence: China. While Washington built walls, Beijing built relationships, discreet, methodical, transactional. Buyers from across Asia had long hoped to diversify their imports away from regions prone to conflict or political volatility. The sudden availability of a North American supplier accessible directly by sea changed calculations across the Pacific. Without speeches, without headlines, without political ceremony, Canada became a strategic alternative. That shift unsettled Washington more than any tariff or diplomatic dispute ever could. For decades, America had grown accustomed to being the gravitational center of Canadian energy. The pipelines pointed south. The pricing benchmarks were calculated at U.S. hubs. The value of Western Canadian Select, WCS, was tied to its relationship with American refiners. But TMX cracked that gravity. With a new outlet came a new dynamic, competition. The U.S. was no longer the only suitor. And in energy politics, the presence of a second option changes everything. Canada's new freedom did not immediately erupt in confrontation or dramatic breakaways. Instead, it manifested in something far more powerful, leverage through choice. Alberta could now decide how much to send south, how much to send west, and when to shift flows depending on global prices. It didn't need to threaten. It didn't need to posture. It simply had alternatives, and alternatives are the real currency of power. Meanwhile, the American energy system, built on the assumption of one-way dependence, began to feel the tremors. Analysts warned that any redirection of Canadian barrels, even modest ones, could send ripples through the Midwest. Refiners designed for heavy crude could not easily swap suppliers. A tanker redirected to Asia meant one less for U.S. pipelines. What seemed like a minor shift on paper became a wake-up call. The United States was no longer in control of the narrative. The supply chain it once saw as secure had become a contested space. In Canada, the mood was different. What Washington perceived as a challenge, Ottawa and Edmonton viewed as overdue liberation. The symbolism of the first Pacific-bound tanker was not lost on policymakers. It represented a new economic era, one where Canada could negotiate from a position of balance rather than obligation. Alberta, long painted as a province chained to American demand, was suddenly stepping onto the global stage with a confidence rooted not in bravado, but in infrastructure. Yet the most profound impact of TMX may not lie in the numbers, the barrels, or the markets. It lies in the psychological shift it triggered. For generations, Canadian leaders had spoken cautiously about diversification, unsure whether geography would ever allow them to achieve it. TMX proved that the barrier was never the mountains, it was the absence of opportunity. Once the door opened, the world poured through. This new chapter also reshaped how Canada viewed itself. It was no longer simply an exporter, it was a strategist. No longer a supplier, a negotiator. And no longer a junior partner, a player capable of influencing global energy flows. That confidence rippled outward, shaping policies in Ottawa, investments in Alberta, and diplomatic postures across Asia. The United States, meanwhile, found itself grappling with an uncomfortable realization. The unlocked door in its tariff wall was now a pathway Canada could walk through on its own terms, not because Washington permitted it, but because Canada built its own exit. TMX did not overturn the relationship between the two countries. It did something subtler and far more enduring. It changed who needed whom. And once a dependency breaks, even slightly, the balance of power begins to tilt, not loudly, not abruptly, but inevitably. There is a moment in every strategic confrontation when the aggressor realizes the battlefield is not reacting the way they expected. A wall is built to stop an opponent, to press them back, to force a concession. But the tariff fortress Washington raised around Canada has an unintended geometry, one that economists are now calling the mirror wall. Instead of absorbing the impact, it reflects pressure directly back onto the very industries it was meant to defend. And nowhere is this reflection more visible than in America's energy network, the silent machinery that powers its factories, farms, highways, and cities. On paper, a 25% barrier sounds like a decisive strike. In practice, it behaves like a boomerang. Each time the United States attempts to squeeze Canadian exports, the effect bounces across its borders and lands squarely on its own economy. Nowhere is this dynamic clearer than in oil, the one resource that Washington could not fully wall off, and the one dependency it cannot untangle quickly. Any disruption, even hypothetical, begins to expose the tension between political posturing and physical reality. Imagine, for a moment, what would happen if the U.S. extended the full 25% burden to Alberta crude. The reaction would be instantaneous. Prices across the Midwest, the beating industrial heart of the United States, would not rise gradually, but lurch upward. Analysts estimate an increase of 15 to 20% almost overnight. Gas stations would feel the shock first, freight carriers next, and then the ripple would travel inward. Grocery chains, construction firms, manufacturers, all linked by the same lifeline of fuel. That spike isn't a market whim. It's the logical consequence of a system engineered around a single input. When refineries locked themselves to heavy crude decades ago, they unknowingly created a structural dependency. They built facilities that thrive when fed a specific type of oil and falter when forced to adapt. In that sense, the refineries are like orchestras trained to play one symphony. Treble and bass, tempo and tone, all calibrated to Alberta's oil sands. Swap in a different composition, and the entire performance collapses into dissonance. Replacing Canadian barrels is not as simple as redirecting tankers from South America or the Middle East. Those shipments must travel longer distances, navigate more uncertain sea routes, and arrive at facilities that were never designed to process their lighter chemical makeup. The mismatch is not theoretical. It is physical, encoded into the molecular behavior of the crude itself. Without the density and sulfur characteristics of oil from Alberta, the American Midwest's refining infrastructure becomes a machine grinding against its own gears. And so, the moment tariffs rise, the machinery groans. Costs swell. Companies pass those costs forward. Consumers absorb the blow. Inflation, a beast Washington has spent years trying to cage, finds a crack in the door and pushes its way back inside. What was meant to pressure a foreign supplier instead becomes a form of economic self-sabotage. Yet the mirror wall does not end with oil. It extends into electricity, a dimension of the North American relationship that rarely makes headlines but carries immense weight. Every year, the United States quietly imports more than 33 terawatt-hours of Canadian power, a flow that keeps data centers humming, defense manufacturing stable, and entire regions insulated from blackouts during peak demand. In this arena, Canada plays the role of a hidden stabilizer, an anchor holding the grid steady during storms literal and economic. Cutting that flow, or even disrupting it by accident, would create consequences far beyond the immediate energy market. States like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, where heavy industry still defines local economies, would feel the strain as factories face higher electricity costs and potential supply insecurity. Again, the pressure rebounds. Again, the mirror wall reflects the blow. This feedback loop, quiet but relentless, explains why so many economists argue that the U.S. cannot weaponize tariffs against Canada without slicing into its own industrial fabric. A wall built with political intent becomes a mirror revealing structural weaknesses. The harder Washington pushes, the clearer that reflection becomes. But there is another layer to this, one even deeper. The mirror wall is not just about economics, it is about misreading power. For years, policymakers framed the U.S.-Canada relationship as a one-way dependency, where America held the leverage by virtue of being the larger economy and the dominant buyer. Yet the moment supply chains are examined up close, the pipelines, the refinery configurations, the electric grid interconnections, a different picture emerges. The power dynamic is not vertical, but horizontal. It is not about dominance, but codependence. And it is Canada, not the United States, that quietly controls the switch most Americans don't know exists. This realization unsettles Washington because it undermines long-standing assumptions. It forces a reevaluation of how influence works in a world where infrastructure, not rhetoric, determines leverage. A nation that builds walls discovers they cannot block the physics of their own supply chain. A nation that builds corridors discovers the world will walk through them. The United States, by doubling down on its tariff defenses, has unintentionally highlighted the narrow passageways through which its own economic stability flows. And this is the heart of the mirror wall. Every tariff aimed outward strengthens Canada's position inward. Every attempt to pressure the North reveals how tightly the American system is tied to it. Every escalation designed to defend American workers ends up threatening them instead. When a wall reflects instead of absorbs, the real struggle is not with the opponent outside, but with the vulnerabilities inside. And in this confrontation, the continent's quiet northern supplier has become the defining variable. Not through force, not through confrontation, simply through the architecture of a system that was built a long time ago, under assumptions that no longer belong to the present. Long before tariff walls, before trade disputes, before tense press conferences shaped the conversation between Washington and Ottawa, Canada had already been preparing a different kind of strategy. It was not loud. It did not come wrapped in slogans or declarations. Instead, it emerged in the form of patience. A long, deliberate game rooted in the belief that the world would eventually value consistency more than dominance. While the United States oscillated between protectionism and global ambition, Canada studied the turbulence and chose a quieter path. That path came into focus under a new philosophy shaped in Ottawa, a tiered engagement strategy designed to move Canada beyond the shadows of its larger neighbor without triggering confrontation. Mark Carney's government understood something essential about the world's new economic climate. That volatility had become the norm, and in a turbulent world, stability behaves like a currency. Nations might chase influence, might build new barriers, might weaponize trade, but eventually every player on the board needs a place where currency, contracts, and supply can be trusted. Canada decided to become that place. What makes this shift remarkable is how unassuming it appears. There were no dramatic pivots or bold announcements. Instead, Policymakers quietly strengthened oversight of sensitive sectors, forged partnerships with Asian markets, and aligned energy, digital infrastructure, and industrial policy around a single principle: be indispensable, not confrontational. While other nations built arsenals of leverage, Canada built corridors of reliability. The linchpin of this transformation was TMX, but Ottawa did not treat the pipeline expansion as a one-dimensional victory. Instead, it used its momentum to knit together what it called the Made in Canada Energy Corridor, an integrated framework linking oil, gas, and emerging clean technologies. TMX became less of a project and more of a signal. Canada was ready to operate on a global stage with its own architecture, not as an extension of American infrastructure. Companies noticed the change almost immediately. The narrowing price gap between Western Canadian Select and West Texas Intermediate meant billions of additional dollars flowing into Canadian producers, revenue that once evaporated in the differential imposed by limited pipeline capacity. Now, Suncor, Cenovus, and other energy giants found themselves holding assets that the world wanted, and finally had a way to deliver. Tankers didn't just carry crude across oceans, they carried a message that Canada could now move value on its own terms. Washington felt the shift, not through speeches, but through silence, the kind of silence that signals a change in gravity. A relationship once dictated by necessity was starting to look like a negotiation between equals. As long as Canadian oil had only one route, the United States had the luxury of assuming the upper hand. But once Canada gained a direct line to Asia, that luxury disappeared. The U.S. found itself staring at a partner whose leverage grew not from confrontation, but from optionality. This evolution came at a moment when global markets were tilting toward uncertainty. Conflicts in one region sent shockwaves through supply chains an ocean away. Resource nationalism made mineral and energy markets unpredictable. Digital services became entangled with geopolitical tensions. In this landscape, Canada's consistency became more than just an advantage, it became a refuge. Countries searching for predictable suppliers began turning toward Ottawa, not for the cheapest contracts, but for the most stable ones. Evidence of this new appeal surfaced quickly. Energy exports to China and across Asia surged by 81% in the first half of 2025. Japan, South Korea, and Germany, nations defined by long-term planning, began locking in multi-year agreements with Canadian producers. Their reasoning was simple: cost matters, but reliability determines survival. Canada had long been known for its natural resources. Now, it was becoming known for something rarer: immunity to volatility. Ottawa recognized this reputation as a strategic asset and treated it accordingly. Policy stability became a national brand, a kind of invisible export as valuable as any barrel of oil. In a world where regulations in some countries changed overnight, Canada's predictability was a competitive weapon without ever being labeled as one. Meanwhile, Alberta and Ottawa, often portrayed as ideological opposites, found themselves aligned by necessity and opportunity. One provided the resource, the other provided the diplomatic architecture. Together, they created a silent alliance that reshaped the continent's energy landscape. Alberta supplied the velocity, Ottawa supplied the direction. And both understood what Washington had overlooked: that the future of influence lies not in overwhelming force, but in being the one partner the world can count on when markets turn chaotic. This quiet alliance also changed the tone within Canada itself. Provinces that once viewed energy policy through the narrow lens of federal-provincial friction began to see a broader national strategy unfolding. The success of TMX was no longer just Alberta's triumph, it was Canada's new diplomatic instrument. Each tanker leaving the Pacific coast carried not just crude, but a redefinition of Canada's role in global affairs. None of this was achieved through confrontation with the United States. Canada had no interest in building its own walls. It had no appetite for tariff battles. Instead, it chose something more subtle and far more powerful: to become the stable alternative in an unstable world. While Washington fortified its borders, Ottawa fortified its credibility. In the end, the rise of the Ottawa-Alberta axis illustrates a profound shift in how power works in the 21st century. Influence does not always roar. Sometimes it moves quietly through dependable supply chains, consistent regulation, and the kind of patience that outlasts political cycles. Canada did not challenge the United States. It simply outgrew the old relationship. The continent's new balance wasn't forged through conflict, but through evolution, a rebalancing shaped by pipelines, partnership, and the steady accumulation of trust. In the end, the story of North America's new energy balance is not about the walls that were built, but the corridors that survived them. The United States raised its tariff fortress believing it could reshape the landscape by force, that pressure alone would bend the continent back into a familiar hierarchy. But the walls did not hold the shape Washington expected. The mirror wall sent every strike back inward, the unlocked door exposed deeper dependencies, and the silent rise of the Ottawa-Alberta axis revealed a truth that had been hiding inside the machinery for decades. Canada never needed to shout to shift this balance. It simply needed a way out, a lane that didn't pass through someone else's gate. TMX offered that lane, and with it came the first subtle but irreversible tilt in leverage. Each barrel that flows west instead of south redraws the map. Each tanker sliding across the Pacific reminds Washington that influence is not preserved by size alone, but by the freedom to choose. And Canada, for the first time in its modern energy history, has the luxury of choice. The United States still holds tremendous power, but it now stands in a world where even a quiet partner can become a strategic anchor. The continent's heartbeat no longer pulses in just one direction. It loops, it reflects, it adjusts, shaped not by confrontation, but by architecture. A pipeline, a policy of stability, a disciplined long game. These became the levers that shifted the center of gravity. And so the real question extends beyond tariffs, beyond oil, beyond the politics of the moment. In an age defined by volatility and walls, which nation will control the flow of power, the one that builds barriers or the one that builds corridors? This is not the end of the story. It is the opening chapter of a continental transformation still unfolding. If you want to follow that shift as it happens in real time, stay with these investigations, and let's keep pulling back the layers of the map together.